In introducing this discussion, what I want to do is paint with a very broad brush what I think is a revolution in the making. This is the revolution, if you like, that got underway in the 20th century and is still in full flight. We don't know where it's going to lead us. It's unlike previous revolutions. It's certainly not at its core an armed revolution, but it's an institutional one, a normative one, and it's occurring under our own very eyes. It's something that we're partly used to, and yet something that we don't at all understand, and the implications are still only dimly perceived by most of us, including those who write learned books on the subject. The revolution I'm referring to is precisely a revolution in governance. We can come at this from a number of angles. One interesting but not necessarily the most profound insight into this, but nevertheless useful, is to just note what has happened literally in the 20th century. If you look at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 20th century, the number of international governmental organizations increased from about 25 to something like 6,500. 25 to 6,500. There is no precedent for this in human history. International governmental organizations of one kind or another, be they regional, global, functional. And if you would turn to non-governmental organizations, the trend line is even more dramatic. From around about 150 at the beginning of the 20th century to just over 44,000 at the end of the century. And we could have done the same thing looking at what's happened in terms of the corporate sector or the marketplace. Not just organizations. If we look at the body of international law, there has been the most dramatic expansion of international legal instruments in every area of human activity. Human rights, trade, finance, development, criminal international humanitarian law, criminal justice, and much else. And the question arises, what is happening and why is it happening? In a nutshell, I think what is happening is that we are, in very small steps but incrementally significant steps, beginning to realize that the dominant institutions, political institutions, governance institutions, which were created by the modern world and which we associate primarily with the modern industrial national sovereign state, that institution and the system of sovereign states is less and less able to handle a number of the most serious challenges confronting humanity today. And this is true whether one looks at questions of the spread of infectious diseases, climate change, the global financial crisis, international terrorism, whatever the issue is. The state, as traditionally understood, less and less equipped to be able to handle these questions. And therefore, the shift that we're seeing, organizationally, legally, and normatively, is a kind of tentative, groping, hesitant response to the nature of the problem. And the nature of the problem is that the state, as traditionally understood, is one whose primary concern is the maintenance of boundaries. Whereas we live in a world which is characterized, first and foremost, by increasing flows of people, of capital and goods and services, arms, technology, information, images, and the like. And these flows are not at all respectful of boundaries. And that's also true of all kinds of people movements, including not just refugees and asylum seekers, but criminals, terrorists, pirates, and many others. And so the question arises, how are human affairs to be organized in this vastly transforming international landscape? And clearly, regional institutions, global institutions, but also below the state, provincial institutions, local institutions are coming to their own in a way that hasn't yet, we haven't seen for some considerable period of time. Institutions at a formal level, I suppose you'd call them public institutions, public governance. But what makes it so much more complicated, difficult to understand, but nevertheless also very challenging for the future, is that over and above these public institutions, all of which to greater or lesser extent are still struggling to come to terms with the reality of what's unfolding, they have increasingly to relate to two other major arenas. And that's what makes it so complex. And the other two arenas are very simple. Civil society, which we often refer to in terms of non-governmental organizations, although that can limit our understanding of what's involved by civil society from the local all the way to the international. On the one hand, civil society on the one hand, and on the other, the terribly important arena, the marketplace. And it's interesting, and I'm going to conclude this in a moment, if you look at Copenhagen, for all its faults and vicissitudes and failed expectations, the composition of those who were there, somewhere around 41,000 people in attendance, 12,000 of whom, 11 to 12,000 of whom were government representatives. The majority were made up by representatives of civil society and the marketplace. Just when I said government representatives, I meant national government. Local government alone had 7,000 representatives. And in fact, much of what's happening internationally these days involves local government institutions. The City of Melbourne has the most extraordinary array of international relationships. And they don't necessarily go through national government for them to pursue sister relationships with other local institutions across borders. And so much more is happening in that context. So whether we're looking at the question of war and peace or human rights or development, we're now dealing, I think, with a much more complex institutional infrastructure than we've been used to. And both scholars and policymakers, and probably citizens as well, are finding it, I think, only just beginning beginning to make sense of this very complex and challenging reality, but one which is will almost certainly become increasingly complex, but also perhaps point to more creative ways of handling many of the contemporary problems that beset humanity, which is on the one hand increasingly unified, technologically, economically, and in other ways, and yet at the same time increasingly fragmented on a number of major political, religious, cultural, ethnic, and other fault lines. And that, in a sense, becomes, if you like, the single most important challenge confronting contemporary governance: how to handle the management of human affairs in a world that is simultaneously singular and plural. That'll do from me.
Thank you. We'll pass straight over to Robyn.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I'd like to address the relationship between power and justice in global governance. We can think of it as a dance with power as the kind of lead partner, but every now and then justice can sometimes lead. What I want to focus on is the institution of multilateralism, which is a sort of compensatory form of rule to make up for the difficulties created by the sovereign state system, which, if we were to design a governance system from scratch, we probably wouldn't choose this particular system, where you have exclusive territorial rule over particular people and territories, which doesn't provide an obvious means for managing common problems, transboundary problems, and also sometimes not even within states. So multilateralism was developed as a compensatory form of rule whereby states get together and reach agreements to deal with those issues that they can't deal with individually. So it was a form of collective global management. The problem is that it's often bossed around by great powers. So I want to use the example of the climate change negotiations to address these dilemmas. And I was one of the 41,000 people at Copenhagen, and I observed the negotiations. And I felt a bit like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, because each day was the same entrenched negotiating positions amongst the same defensive negotiating blocs. And in many ways, the climate change negotiations are now likened to the Doha round of trade negotiations. But what I want to do is not just sketch the problem. I want to try and offer at least a modest proposal. I'm not a magician. I can't solve the problems of the world, but I want to think of how we can bring a little more justice to temper power in global governance. I want to start by drawing out a tension that became absolutely manifest at Copenhagen, but it's been emerging for the 20-year negotiating history of the climate negotiations. And that is the growing frustration amongst both participants and observers at this glacial pace of progress. But what this frustration has generated is two absolutely contradictory sets of proposals in the climate blogosphere. The first set of proposals says that this process of negotiation is fatally cumbersome. You can't have 193 states negotiating probably one of the most complex treaties ever negotiated, line by line, because the provision is for consensus decision-making. The actual text runs over 150 pages. It's really tricky. They say, wouldn't it make more sense to round up the top emitters? The top 10 carbon polluters produce about 2/3 of global emissions. The top 3/4 produce, the top 20 emitters produce 3/4. So what we need is a mini-lateralist response. Okay, just herd up the big players and get them to agree and move forward. So that's one set of responses. Move them to the Major Economies Forum or the G20 perhaps. The other set of proposals is diametrically opposed to that. It says what we have is a failure of procedural justice. Those communities that are going to be worst hit by climate change are in the least developed countries of the world that have very small delegations. English is not their native language. They're not across all the side agreements. They're locked out of the insider dealing. They've got advance purchase air tickets. They have to leave on time when the negotiations spill over. At every turn, they're procedurally disadvantaged. In fact, the Copenhagen Accord, which was negotiated between President Obama and the leaders of the 4 biggest emitters in the developing world, the so-called BASIC group, which is China, India, South Africa and Brazil, they did a background deal and produced a very short political accord, which when it was produced to the plenary at the very end, a group of bolshy Latin American countries, Bolivia and a few others, and Sudan, which was leading the G77, objected, and therefore it wasn't accepted by the Conference of the Parties because of a failure of procedure. They didn't follow the normal procedures. So here you have NGOs backing developing countries saying we need more inclusive negotiations so those most affected by climate change have a seat at the table. What do? We have an impasse. A push for minilateralism on the one hand, exclusive minilateralism, and on the other hand, a push for more inclusive multilateralism. And we're not even talking about NGOs here. We're just trying to produce a form of negotiation that has less procedural irregularities. Well, both can't be right. I'm going to suggest an alternative, which I call inclusive minilateralism. Okay, nice and symmetrical. But before I get there, I think we need to remind ourselves that if we look at the history of multilateralism, and some of the most successful examples, they were usually preceded by minilateral negotiations, which were disguised forms of multilateralism. Even when the UN played a leadership role once upon a time in the immediate post-World II period, a lot of the major institutions that were created then, which are heralded as good multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, for example, were full of asymmetries, where they privileged the great powers. And this is not unusual. The Security Council of the UN gives a veto to what were then the major powers. The Non-Proliferation Treaty privileges the nuclear weapon states. The Bretton Woods institutions is based on $1, one vote, so the finance ministers of the richest countries get to call the shots. This is not unusual. What's really interesting about the negotiations of the climate treaty and several other major environmental treaties is that it's pushing away from the traditional liberal ideal of multilateralism, which is based on juridical sovereignty, even though in fact it's not that, towards what I call affirmative multilateralism, because the purpose of environmental multilateralism is to redress injustices, close the development gap, and acknowledge that if you had tit-for-tat emission reductions by rich and poor world, then you're effectively kicking the ladder down. And so the whole objectives, the burden-sharing principles of the climate regime acknowledge that those that are responsible for most of the emissions that have been put there historically are the rich countries, and they have the biggest per capita footprint and the best capability to respond. And the developing countries, admittedly some are growing and putting growing emissions in aggregate terms into the atmosphere, but they have huge development needs. But the procedures of negotiation are not fit for purpose. So maybe we can learn a lesson here. Think of the failure of the League of Nations, and there are parallels here with the Kyoto Protocol. Created by and large by Woodrow Wilson in terms of the principles. They created it and then they walked away. The US was pretty much doing the same thing with the Kyoto Protocol when that was negotiated in 1997. They put in all these flexible instruments to make achieving targets easier, like emissions trading and what have you. Then, of course, they walked away because the Senate wouldn't ratify it. But think of the United Nations and the way it's not been perfect, but we're better off for having it than not having it, where you acknowledge the superpowers, and they did have a privileged role in the Security Council. But of course the world's moved on since then. So what I want to suggest is a minilateral solution where you have the major emitters, but you also have representatives from the least developed countries and ensure regional representation. And that smaller streamlined group, because you do need smaller streamlined negotiations over text before you bring it to the larger conference of the parties, might provide one means by which those problems can be addressed. That's not to say that the major emitters are likely to necessarily accept that, because we've got a horrible dilemma, and that is the more you try and improve the inclusiveness of the negotiations, the more you risk the great powers walking away and either not dealing with it, saying we don't have to talk to these small players. So you've got a real risk. You need great power buy-in, but you don't want emissions power to replace normative power or justice. You want to somehow bridge them. But the more you move towards exclusive minilateralism, that is, you exclude those that are most affected, the smaller, weaker states, you're going to have an illegitimate treaty. And we saw this even with the Copenhagen Accord. And I think a primary school kid could probably say, since when would you produce a fair anti-pollution treaty if you just leave it to the big polluters to negotiate it? That's just intuitively, morally repugnant. So if we accept that the negotiations are becoming bogged down, then what you need to do is design procedures that are fit for purpose, that acknowledge the normative purpose, the affirmative purpose of redressing injustices or preventing major injustices on the one hand, but acknowledging the need for great power buy-in on the other hand. And in this way, I'll finish by just quoting, I think it was an India Observer that said, if you think of the atmosphere as a pizza, then the rich countries have eaten 3/4 of the slice, and they insist on sharing the remaining piece, whereas the developing countries say, we want a larger portion of that remaining piece because you guys have been gutsers, effectively. Or, to mix metaphors, if you freeze frame the structural inequalities in the world by insisting on equal commitments by rich and poor, then you are effectively kicking the ladder down. And you must have those who are worst affected at the negotiating table. So I guess between inclusive multilateralism and exclusive minilateralism, perhaps inclusive minilateralism may be the way forward. Thanks.
Andrew.
Well, thanks, Dennis. I think this discussion is quite a timely one. Recent years have seen shifts in global geopolitics with significant implications for those of us who are struggling, working for a positive change in the world. From Oxfam's perspective, many of these changes are not so much to do with the architecture of global governance, though obviously the emergence of G20 is an extremely important development, but it's more the changing context. I mean, Joe's and Robyn have talked about some of that context, that changing context, but just to highlight 3 or 4 important trends and developments. There's a changing power balance with the rise of the BRICS countries, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, coupled with the decline of players like Britain and France. There's the increasingly pivotal role of the private sector in global power relations. There's an increasing number of global issues which demand global solutions. The climate change is an obvious, but the global financial crisis, the increases in food prices and in general food insecurity, increases in fuel prices, what's been called a perfect storm. And then that's all against a backdrop of some quite spectacular failures of the current multilateral system. Going back to the Rwandan genocide of 15 years ago, the fact that the Doha round is going nowhere in the World Trade Organisation, and the extremely difficult negotiations around climate change are just three of the prime examples one could give about the failures of the current way of doing things. What I'd like to do is just unpack some of these developments and try to give some thought about ways ahead. It does appear that we are moving towards, quite clearly, to a multipolar world. And the contrast, I know Joe on previous occasions has contrasted back in the late 1940s, where the United States could basically dictate the whole global architecture at that point, from the Bretton Woods institutions to the UN to the security arrangements. Now they can't even get, back in the early part of this century, couldn't even get the majority of the Security Council to endorse the war against Iraq. We have this trend to a multipolar world. It's been suggested it's irreversible. Some have even suggested we're moving to a point where we'll be a no-polar world, where there won't be any one significant player. From the development perspective, this is raising some really significant issues. China, for instance, is investing very heavily in Africa. Just over a year ago, China announced 8 significant new measures to strengthen its relationship with African cooperation. The President stated plainly, quote, "Whatever change may take place in the world, our policy of supporting Africa's economic and social development will not change." But their developmental approaches differ markedly from the global consensus around development, best demonstrated through the Paris Agenda and the Accra Accord. While the West may support microfinance or an emphasis on good governance, China's created a $5 billion equity fund to foster investment. I was recently in Zimbabwe and I just kept on coming across Chinese dining out and working in mining and in retail and a whole range of other areas. The Chinese and other new aid donors, like the Koreans or the Brazilians or Indians, are outside the Global Development Club, best demonstrated by the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. And that poses some major issues about standards and about quality and about cooperation on the ground. It is an issue for us about where the focus of that development work is going to take place. There's been a lot of focus, for instance, on the least developed countries. They're the countries who rank at the bottom of virtually every league table. Except the majority of the world's poor actually live in middle-income countries. 3/4 of the world's poor now live in middle-income countries, countries like China and India, or even in Indonesia. 66 million in Indonesia, 35 million in Pakistan. So our development approaches and the implications that has for global architecture and global governance are going to change. The G20's emergence over the last couple of years has been, I think, extremely important. It's a trend, it's an institution which Oxfam, for one, has been supporting its development. We don't believe it's a panacea by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a much more representative decision-making body than the G8, which I think is withering on the vine virtually as we speak. But if the G20 is going to establish itself as the preeminent global economic body, it will need to act on issues beyond the immediate preoccupations of its members, so beyond the handling of the global financial situation. Specifically, we'd argue that it needs to demonstrate leadership on the interlinked threats of economic, food and climate crises, trying to find a way through, navigate a way through the perfect storm. And it needs to take action on global poverty. The G20's talked about development issues since the 2009 London summit, but has so far failed to establish a coherent agenda. Next month, the G20 is meeting in Seoul. We're advocating, and I think with some success, that there's a case for a new and comprehensive development consensus, what we're calling a Seoul development consensus, to focus on the needs of the poorest of the poor, wherever they may be located. And I think the G20 meeting in Seoul, the G20 leaders meeting in Seoul next month, will be a real test of the G20's willingness and ability to make that commitment to step beyond their immediate concerns. But importantly, I think that these sort of forums need to supplement rather than undermine United Nations General Assembly and other UN processes. We've already had far too much experience of the G8 operating effectively outside of the UN's remit. We then have a whole range of issues where we need global action, but as Robyn in particular has highlighted, we've found it extraordinarily difficult to make any real movement. That perfect storm of the global financial crisis, of the food insecurity, of climate change, the people most affected are those people whose voices are not being heard in any of the forums. I won't labour the point about the consequences for people. The reality is those people least responsible are being hurt the hardest. We have increasing numbers of people living in food insecurity. We have the global financial crisis affecting people in developing countries, particularly those countries which had started to integrate with the global economy to a much greater degree than even countries like Australia. That's going to pose questions, particularly for those countries looking for a permanent seat or more regular representation on the Security Council, those middle-income countries, those BRIC countries. We've a particular concern for Oxfam is the real crisis in the international humanitarian system. We currently have a system which is dependent upon United Nations agencies, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and non-government organisations, coping with crises such as the ones that we have currently in Pakistan or in Haiti early on this year. We'd argue that that system is at a point of collapse, but looking forward, the pressures are going to be even greater. We did some analysis last year looking at the numbers of people affected by climate-related natural emergencies. And the numbers of people, the most recent figures, were about 250 million. On current trends, there are going to be about 374 million people affected by climate-related natural emergencies in the year 2015. The system can't cope at the moment, as we have seen in Pakistan, as we see in Haiti, as we see in the many crises which do not get media coverage. Our fear is that it will continue to be under-resourced, poorly coordinated, and will face quite grave consequences for the most vulnerable populations throughout the developing world. There is also the issue about the responsibility to protect and the importance of those humanitarian disasters which have a conflict-related dimension. And here we need to incorporate some of the positive wording which has come through in recent years much more firmly into requirements for all member nations of the United Nations, but particularly those members of the Security Council. We've made a number of recommendations about how those countries can take on board their responsibility to protect, including annual statements to the General Assembly, renouncing the use of their veto when the Security Council is discussing situations of actual and incipient war crimes or crimes against humanity or ethnic cleansing or genocide, and opening up the Security Council for more open meetings. This is all predicated on the assumption that some way or another we've got to find a way of reinvigorating, revitalising multilateralism. It may be through some of the means which Robyn has suggested and Joe has hinted, but it brings to mind the old adage that Churchill once said, it's the worst possible system except for all others. We do need this process of bringing together nations, bringing together nation states, and being able to tackle effectively some of the crises that we face. Thank you.
I'd like to start, and I think this was the drift of what I was saying, but of course I didn't spell it out. The state is not quite as central, even as we speak, as most people think. This is only just how it looks to the naked eye. But let's be deceived by how it looks to the naked eye. We need a little bit of X-ray vision. And when Obama and Wen Jiabao were having their discussion in Copenhagen, they largely came, let's face it, two of the world's most powerful states, and the two most significant leaders in each case of those particular states, in terms of the affairs of government. They came largely their hands tied behind their backs. It's not as if they could have come and said, oh, yes, we'll consider this, we'll make a compromise here. They don't have that kind of power and capacity. Wen Jiabao came with very clear instructions from the largest corporations in China, state and private. There was a limit, a very strict limit to what he could and could not say, let alone strictures from his own party. And similarly, Obama, in a more complex way, was under very severe constraints, not least keeping in mind how Congress was behaving and might evolve post the forthcoming elections. But again, very powerful interests. So I think we need to, first of all, get a much, shall we say, a realistic understanding of how, in fact, most states, when they supposedly take up positions or fail to take them up, are in fact themselves responding to some of the most powerful pressures currently operating in the market, from the marketplace, from the corporate sector. That's the reality. And it seems to me, therefore, that one of the things we need to do is, rather than have this shadow boxing continue indefinitely into the future, we must find ways internationally of bringing the corporate sector into full participation. Because at the moment, they appear to have a kind of invisibility, even though it is they primarily who often determine what particular position is taken on a range of issues. Not just the obviously economic issues or environmental issues or development issues which have economic implications, including issues of war and peace and human rights. So it seems to me, I know it's a long-term view, but, and the previous UN Secretary General made a small attempt at moving in this direction, the UN system as a whole must bring the corporate sector to account much more effectively than is now the case. And by providing them with forums in which the spotlight is placed on them, I think that becomes a much more effective measure for doing this. The other thing I would say is, of course, it's a three-way relationship. It's civil society, it's the market, which primarily means the corporate sector, and it is public institutions. And we need to think of them as operating at 5 levels, each of them: local, provincial, national, regional, and global. And we need to have much more effective linkages between the 5 levels and the 3 arenas than we have so far. And the UN system, reformed over the next 10 to 20 years, will need to integrate these much more complex sets of linkages between arenas and tiers of organisation.
We certainly need politics to catch up with markets. I think we need to think not just in terms of guns and money or security and economics, but also civil society. But for me, the overarching economic philosophy that sort of became entrenched in the 80s, and that's neoliberalism, is for me one of the big bogeymen here, because that governance philosophy, which sought to relinquish so much to markets, I think has been proved wrong time and time again. Most of us were hoping that the global financial crisis would cause some serious rethinking, but it's only produced some tinkering. And we don't really want more and more disasters to make the point. We'd like to be able to head these things off. But markets, of course, are creatures of states. States and markets are mutually sort of constituted in this sense. States created this globalised world through liberalising, removing so many restrictions on the movement of money, people, goods and so forth. But they can also de-orchestrate it or re-orchestrate it in ways where you've got socially responsible and ecologically responsible markets working. And civil society can play a huge role in that, and they can do that behind the back of states. They can do that with powerful consumer boycotts. They can do that by becoming shareholders in corporations. They can do that just by running civil society campaigns. But at the end of the day, we do want to see re-regulation of a different kind, a more socially and ecologically disciplined regulation. And I'm a strong believer in the need for a legal regime, a global regime, to regulate transnational corporations. I don't think the UN's Global Compact is enough. Corporations will always push the line that voluntary self-regulation is the way to go. But I think a time for much more concerted regulation, and particularly financial regulation, so we can impose something like a Tobin tax on financial transactions, which would be a fantastic stream of revenue, which you could do a lot of good things. So politics does have to catch up with markets and then change markets.
Two comments. First of all, just about civil society. I think we have to trying to think as creatively as possible about forging a global civil society and building those connections. We're still too stuck in our national boundaries in terms of civil society. And that means looking for connections between North and South in a much more effective way than what we've been able to do hitherto. Secondly, in terms of the economy and the role of the private sector, I fear that the political opportunity for genuine change is rapidly passing until the next crisis. I think we had a chance when the global financial crisis was at its most severe. There was movement there for some degree of regulation, greater regulations, particularly of financial markets, and we've stripped it. And globally we've stripped it. And unless we can try to turn that around quite rapidly, we're going to go through another opportunity lost. And that, to say the least, I think has significant consequences in the short to medium term, let alone the longer term. So I think we need to refocus attention on some things which can be done to re-regulate the market. It may be things like a financial transaction tax. It may be action against tax havens. Those sorts of things would have some great significance. So far as I think Joe was saying about the UN's extremely tentative steps in this direction around the Global Compact, that's all they are. They're extremely tentative and very short and very modest in their level of ambition. At G20, I think Australia should continue to play an extremely active and positive role there. As I suggested, I think it should be arguing for a broader agenda. We want development issues to be much more firmly on that list. Second thing I'd say is I think it's very important Australia gets elected to the Security Council. I think that is actually meaning that Australia is getting engaged with a range of players right around the globe. It would only be 2 years, but it would help focus attention both at a governmental level and in the community as a whole for some of those debates and some of the issues which can happen at the United Nations level. I've seen the role that middle-level powers can play at a Security Council level when they're members of the Security Council, even for that temporary 2-year period. So they're the two things which I'd put on the agenda for here and now.
There needs to be an effective coalition between, let's say, Australia and a few other like-minded states, a number of key international institutions, not just global but regional, Asia-Pacific, and there has to be a tangible, well-coordinated civil society grouping around specific issues, whether it be climate change or whether it be nuclear disarmament and nuclear proliferation or whether it be a set of human rights responsibility to protect humanitarian issues and whatever. It can't be across too many, but whichever one it is has to be well funded. Back of the envelope calculation, very clear, less than 50 million, don't even talk about it, closer to 100. $100 million commitment to working on one, maximum 2 initiatives with that kind of coalition framework in mind. Is Rudd interested? I don't know. We'll soon find out.
My heart's desire is for Australia to understand moral leadership. Our foreign policy tradition, for certain periods in our history, has seen us playing the role as a creative middle power, playing the role of a good international citizen. Dr. Hewett, even Gareth Evans, but during the Howard period and in recent years, all our defence papers and so forth are always called in the national interest. And if we want a seat at the Security Council, if we're now in the G20, if we want to be inside the tent with the big guys when we're talking about climate change, we have to put our own house in order. And so this idea that we can't lead because we'll suffer, that's sort of, I think, the dominant framing of the discourse in Australia on climate change pretty much since 1988, when the issue first really hit the national stage, but particularly since 92, when the Framework Convention was signed, was that we will suffer a first mover disadvantage, and we will wait and wait. There's the open door. We'll wait others to go through, and then we might follow, rather than saying after you. If we were to forge ahead, you'll be amazed what those first mover advantages are, not only in sort of technological innovation and anticipating rising green demand, but setting an example in all sorts of ways, because Germany's done this and Britain in recent years has done that. And you'd be amazed what kind of moral capital will accompany that type of leadership and will add to Australia's stature, and it would be far more of a significant voice in some of the major multilateral negotiations or minilateral ones in the Security Council and G20, but also more broadly speaking. And I think that would do us a great credit.